Sanjay, you have a new essay out that's really about this. It's about the impact of AR-15 style weapons on the human body. And you talk about how your professor from med school taught you about the impact of different firearms on the human body using watermelons. What did you learn?
Yeah, this was some 30 years ago, and it was a pretty indelible experience, I think, for most of us med students who, on the last day of this particular lecture, took us to a gun range with handguns and rifles and basically fired at watermelons sitting on top of barrels to give us an idea of exactly the difference between these different firearms. And it was something that really, I think stuck with all of us, much in the way that showing black lungs really makes you never want to smoke. You looked at a handgun, you saw that watermelon have an entrance wound and an exit wound, like Matthew was just talking about. With a handgun, the wounds were about the same size. You could see the beveling of the skin on the entrance wound inward and the beveling outward on the exit wound, but a linear sort of bullet-sized trajectory. With a AR-15 or a rifle, in that case, you saw a entrance wound that may have been similar size, but you saw an exit wound that was much bigger, but inside the watermelon. When we opened up that watermelon, we basically saw that it had been cored out. There was so much energy that was actually transferred inside the watermelon that it just sort of shredded all the tissue inside. That's what happens. You just saw the difference in force there, foot-pounds of force between a handgun. The velocity and the energy coming out of that versus a rifle is very different. And people have a misconception often that again, many people who study these types of things understand, but the munition itself is often smaller in one of these AR-15 style rifles, larger in a handgun. It is all about the velocity. And that velocity creates so much different energy within the body, and that causes these types of injuries that Matthew and everyone else has been talking about.
Now, Sanjay, you also talk about your time reporting and even operating in Iraq. What did you learn there?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting when I was over there and when I was finishing med school, there was a ban on these types of AR-15 type weapons in the United States. So we weren't seeing a lot of these in hospitals. So the first time I saw these types of injuries on an actual body, not a watermelon, was over in Iraq. And I mean, it was again, just this indelible thing. Mark Biello, who's a cameraman, and I mean, there's things that, still very hard to talk about, but, when you see a weapon, a firearm like that can blow a limb completely off a body, or in the beginning when these patients would come in, we weren't sure if they had been shot or if they had been a victim of an IED or a grenade explosion or something. That's how challenging it was sometimes. And then coming back to the States, in the mid part of last decade, and starting to see these types of injuries in my home city, that was quite stunning.